Hey everyone, I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast.
Debating Mathy Topics and Mathy Pedagogy with Mathy people just like you.
Let's get into this month's debate. Have you ever attended a PD or read about a strategy that works for teaching both reading and then we're asked to use it in math as well? There are times when these two pedagogies can overlap, but should they?
Well, we have a very special family episode for you today. We're going to hear a husband and a wife debate it out on this very topic, answering the question, should we be comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math?
Oh, and by the way, this couple started presenting together in 2013, and over the years, they've done countless workshops together for schools, districts, at local, state, regional, and national conferences.
They said that together, the greatest accomplishment is that they have raised two perfect children who are not at all complicated teenagers.
Well, with that, I think it's time to go into introductions. So first up, arguing that we should be comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math, we have an educator in his 28th year of education who taught grades 3 through 8 for 8 years while also getting a master's degree at Columbia University's Teacher College and then a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has an extraordinary passion for fractions, and if anyone says they hate fractions, he'll change their mind within 10 minutes. Ooh, it's a challenge there. He loves to spend time with his family and has kept score at every single one of his son's baseball games every spring and summer for the past 10 years. He claims to know every word to every song and supports his wife who sings along to every song but knows none of the words. It's Ryan Flessner. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Chris, how are you here? Hi, Courtney.
Ryan, good to have you here. Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
I can. I am a professor of education at Butler University in Indianapolis. This is my 15th year here after spending several years in several elementary classrooms.
Very good. And now the question we ask all of our guests, when did math first become controversial to you?
Yeah, that's an easy question to answer. I was always told that I was really good at math. I was in the honors track in high school. And when I got into teaching, I thought this is going to be a breeze. And I had to teach my fifth graders how to divide fractions. And so I just kind of played up what I had been told. I told them to write down the first fraction, sprinkle fairy dust on the division sign, and turn it into a multiplication sign. And then that would magically flip the second fraction as well. I thought it'd be boring if I just told them to invert and multiply. But when they asked me why we do that, I didn't really have an answer. And I thought that was really problematic. So I've kind of spent the rest of my career really digging into math and trying to figure out how we can make it more meaningful to kids.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I just learned that there's no such thing as magic fairy dust to turn it into a multiplication sign. Now arguing that we should not be comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math, we have the other half of this married couple, an educator who has seen schools from a plethora of perspectives as a student, teacher, softball coach, instructional coach, administrator, community member, consultant, and currently as a director of Keep Indiana Learning, as well as the host of the Math and Other Things podcast. With 2 master's degrees from Columbia University's Teacher College, she's just a dissertation away from being the most educated Flessner. She has a passion for white books, power polygons, Canva, Danskos, and Diet Coke. In her spare time, she can be found attending her children's athletic events, reading books, and listening to podcasts about education, and watching romantic comedies. It's Courtney Flessner. Hi, Courtney.
Hey, you guys. Hey, Chris. Hey, Rob.
Can you remind the listeners where you are, what your current role is?
Sure. I am also in Indianapolis, Indiana, and my current role is the director of Keep Indiana Learning, which is the professional learning department at the Central Indiana Educational Service Center. So every time I introduce myself, I'm like, so many words, but that is what it is. And then, so I sort of oversee all of the PD and anything that we do, but I also am in the schools quite a bit doing math professional learning with teachers.
Great. And when did math first become controversial to you?
Yeah, so every time I listen to one of your episodes, I think I have a different answer that comes up in my head for that. So I sort of have to give two, but I'll be quick. The first one is I was teaching in Wisconsin, in Janesville, Wisconsin. We had just adopted everyday math. And we were kind of told, like we had really good training. Not every district does that anymore with new textbooks, but we had really good training, and they were like, just do what the book says and you'll be fine. Everyone will be great. And so it took like 4 seconds to find out that wasn't going to be the way it was. But also, I was teaching 4th and 5th grade at the time, and I'm doing multiplication, and it was the first time ever. So at this point, I was probably like almost 30. It was the first time ever in my life I saw the partial products algorithm, and I could not believe it, because the standard US traditional algorithm for multiplication always really stressed me out. And I think it was because I didn't know why it worked. I was just following directions. And then this day comes that I'm teaching partial products, and all of a sudden I understood it all. And I thought, I felt like I'd been cheated my whole life, and I had been wasting my time with this stupid algorithm, when I didn't have a calculator around. And that was very disappointing. And to this day, if I have to model the traditional US algorithm for multiplication, I'm sweating. My hands are sweating talking about it right now. I do not like that algorithm. And if I had had an opportunity to learn partial products, things would have potentially been really different for me in my entire math career. So there's that. And then the other piece of it is, the biggest thing that I hear, not the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that I hear is story problems. Kids are having such a terrible time with story problems, and there's a lot of issues around how teachers are teaching that using, cubes or tips and tricks and whatever. And I started thinking one day about, like, I think I legitimately would follow the directions, like circle the numbers and underline the words. And then I would just sit there and stare at the problem, not knowing what to do, even though I had followed those directions. And here we are, like 40 years later from starting word problems. And I really think I had questions. Like, I wanted to know more about the word problem. I didn't want to just circle numbers and underline keywords. And I wasn't like allowed to read the problem. And I think that I always wonder how often that's happening to kids when they're given shortcuts, how if they have more questions and they feel like they can't ask them. And so those are two, I think, big moments for me.
I think our previous guests would like that you call it the US algorithm, the standard US algorithm. We'll get into that some other time. But welcome to you both. And with that, let's get into the debate.
Great. I'm ready.
All right. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have 2 minutes to present your arguments. And we're going to start here with Ryan arguing that we should be comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math. Ryan, you're up first, and your 2 minutes begins now.
So good teaching in one subject often translates to good teaching in other subjects. Students need familiar routines in order to predict a schedule or flow to their day. The comfort of routines allows children to focus on new learning instead of managing the unpredictability of instruction from subject to subject and from day to day. For instance, if teachers use learning centers, small group stations, the workshop model, menus of activity choices, or other pedagogies for reading and writing, these same ideas can be used for math instruction. Why should the teaching of mathematics feel different than instruction in any other subject? If educators use reading and writing notebooks, a logical connection is the use of a math notebook. If we encourage children to use just right books to ensure they're reading texts that draw on their strengths while allowing them to learn developmentally appropriate reading skills, shouldn't we do the same in math? A parallel concept to the idea of just right books would be to offer children just right numbers when solving math problems. If kids are struggling with a mathematical concept, why wouldn't we allow them to find numbers that work for them, build their confidence in their mathematical understandings, and then scale up the complexity of the work, just as we do in reading? If kids already know a concept, why wouldn't we encourage them to complicate the problem and push them to grow as mathematicians, just as we do in reading? Why would we differentiate the teaching of reading, but force all children to use the same numbers during math instruction? All subject areas now include an immense amount of reading. With a focus on real-world problems in mathematics classrooms, students must navigate lengthy paragraphs of text prior to engaging in mathematical content. Ties to reading instruction will ensure children can access the mathematics embedded within these long passages of written text. To sum things up, the teaching of mathematics has many parallels to the teaching of reading. When we teach mathematics in ways that differ greatly from reading, we send unintended messages to children that math is different, that math is hard, or that some people are strong readers and some people are strong mathematicians. Let's change the narratives. All kids can excel in all subjects.
Thank you, Ryan. And now we're going to hear from Courtney, arguing that we should not be comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math. Courtney, you have 2 minutes, and it begins now.
All right. So it's actually interesting for me to be taking this particular side of whether or not we should compare the teaching of reading to the teaching of math, because it was that comparison that started my journey of not only rethinking how I taught mathematics, but the very way I felt about math. I stood in front of my classroom full of fourth grade students after a math lesson where I spent the majority of my time in my overhead projector and looked at a sea of completely disinterested students, and I knew I had to change something. I was very lucky. I lived with my original math colleague, mentor, and critical friend. He taught me all the things, and I made the connections to the teaching of reading. That helped me quite a bit, actually. However, after watching the past several years transpire around issues in the teaching of reading, I'm realizing I don't want to have to make that comparison. I want math to stand on its own because math is awesome. A district recently called me to tell me the teachers just didn't have time to teach basic math fact fluency. I responded with, "Do they have enough time to teach phonics?" And the administrator responded with, "Okay, yes, enough said." Why? Why do I have to make that comparison for kids to have the opportunity to play games, do number talks, and engage in really amazing instruction around basic math facts? Here's the deal. I have some ideas about what Ryan will say, and I have no doubt every single one of them will be spot on and totally accurate, and I'll probably agree. However, what I have watched transpire about the teaching of reading in my 28 years of being in education, particularly in the past several years, I don't want to see that happen with math. If we're comparing the teaching of reading to the teaching of math, then I'm afraid we're opening the teaching of math up to unnecessary controversy and potential vilification of people, programs, and pedagogy. That's just not what the teaching of math should ever be about. Bottom line, we don't need reading. Math can stand on its own. It's a privilege, an honor to teach and learn math, and it's our job as math educators to make people find that joy in math.
A lot of shots from both sides already. However, both sides have probably already heard these arguments just wandering through the hall making dinner or something.
We haven't. There's been no conversation.
Well, so my first question after hearing like both statements and then also thinking about leading up to this, I think like we normally want to start with talking about maybe vocabulary. I feel like that's like a low hanging fruit. And how does the role of vocabulary development in reading compare to the role of mathematical vocabulary in learning math? And Ryan, I'll actually start with you, and then Courtney, I'll give you a chance to kind of talk about it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, this actually brings up a really good point. I was talking with some teachers in a professional development situation a few days ago, and I used the word equation, and they were primary teachers, and they said, well, can we use the phrase number sentences, which is something I hear a lot. I see it in a lot of the math textbooks. It's a phrase I've used myself. And as soon as I heard that, I kind of cringed, and I thought, I haven't used that phrase in a long time because I don't think that there are I don't think everything is necessarily compatible across the two domains, reading and math. But what I do think is important is that we make sure that the vocabulary that we use is precise. If mathematicians are supposed to use the mathematical practices from the Common Core, one of them is attend to precision. And one of those pieces of precision is not just getting correct answers. It's about using the correct vocabulary. So if we don't use the correct vocabulary, how can we expect kids to use that vocabulary? So when it comes to vocabulary development, I think that it's really important, but I think that sometimes the vocabulary that we use with kids is influenced by reading in ways that it shouldn't be. And so how do we make sure that we're using what we know about reading and writing to draw the comparisons between just using good vocabulary, not trying to change our vocabulary to make it sound like reading or writing vocabulary?
Courtney?
Yeah, so I actually I like Ryan's example because of equations and number sentences, because I think that's a perfect example of how we want to teach vocabulary in context, right? So you're gonna find classrooms where kids are, writing down definitions of vocabulary words that they have to memorize, and then they take a multiple choice on it or a matching test or whatever on it later. And like, we do not want that happening in reading. So that would be one concern, where it's like, okay, I have to pay attention to vocabulary. Here's this list of words that I have to do in this unit. So I'm going to have them write down definitions and we'll give them a test on that. But we want that done in context. We also want vocabulary teaching done in reading in context, but there's a lot of misconceptions there. So if math is standing alone and we're talking about the attending to precision and we're talking about using it in context, and we're really forcing teachers to think hard about the words that they're using and why they're using them, then they'll model that for their kids. And then, maybe they'll learn to use that in reading instead of what they've maybe already been doing. So it's the context that matters. I totally agree on the attending to precision, but I think it's one of the challenges and why math needs to stand alone, because I work primarily with elementary level teachers, and beyond for sure, but there's a lot of their math identity is a struggle, and they don't know what words to use. And I'll do a PD and they'll be like, I learned words I never knew existed before today. And I'm like, great, go back, use them all the time, annoy your kids with how much you're saying them. So I think that's part of the challenge, and why math needs to stand alone is to encourage that challenge.
I want to bring up, Ryan mentioned a lot about like having familiar routines, and I think like it could, ease the cognitive load on students, especially like in elementary when you have the same teacher. And I'm wondering, Courtney, if you can kind of address that a little bit. Like, isn't it nice to have like similar routines, like, versus like math, English looks like this and math is like at the vertical white space or whatever. Like there's always differences. Like, wasn't it nice for kids to have like the repetitiveness of routines and familiar routines?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Here's my question. How often do those routines start in math class? Or are those routines done in other content areas and then they make the connections in math class? Let's start the routines in math class, and then we're following along those routines in other content areas.
You want math to lead the way. And then Ryan, kind of the same question though, like, I'm wondering, do students get bored if like we're always doing the same routines over again, like in every subject? Isn't it better to mix things up and have, I don't know if English can do vertical non-permanent surfaces or not, but isn't it good to have some variety for students?
So I would say that, first of all, Courtney's eyebrows raised when you said, can we do English at vertical non-surfaces, or non-permanent surfaces? And there's a whole conference about that this summer that you go to Seattle. Does it happen just in math, or is it for every subject area? But I think that the biggest point that I think needs to be made is that kids need some type of consistency. They need to know what's coming next. And if we're constantly changing things up, why does reading and writing feel so different from math? Teachers have a lot of worries about teaching math. They aren't as comfortable teaching math, most of them, as they are with teaching reading and writing. So when Courtney asks, why aren't those routines coming from math? My response would be because people aren't confident in math. So why not build on their strength? Let's start with what they're comfortable with. If they feel good about reading and writing, let's help them understand that they can take those same ideas and make them happen in a math classroom. If you have kids sitting knee to knee and reading and then having a conversation about a book, why wouldn't you want to do the same thing about a problem in math? Sit the kids down next to each other, have them talk about, or have them calculate the problem, and then talk to each other about their strategies. Those routines that we're having in the reading classroom are the same type of social interactions we want them having in a math classroom. I see what she's saying, but until we have teachers who feel completely confident in the teaching of math, how do we get those routines to happen in math class so they can happen in a language arts classroom?
So I want to take it down to like the teacher level, and like something that's like a hot button topic in math: memorization. So how does like the role of memorization differ in the acquisition for reading skills versus like math skills, and what are the implications for teaching one or the other way? And that could be, Courtney, you can go first.
Yeah, I think this is where things have gotten a little bit tricky and interesting, in that with the science of reading movement, And a lot of misunderstandings about this is all about phonics. This is all about phonics, and they have to do phonics. And are your classrooms doing phonics? And the classroom should be doing phonics, but they also should be doing many other things. And so that would be an example of how I don't want kids in my classroom only doing like place value drills or making sense of numbers and different names for numbers or whatever. I want all of those things to be done in context. So phonics doesn't stand alone. Like memorizing the sounds of every letter doesn't stand alone. We end up putting all of those sounds together to make words, right? So understanding that we have digits and we have numbers and we have numerals, and what are all the differences between that, and having kids explore that and experiment with that and add that into context like that, we're showing them right away. This isn't a one thing at a time. These are things that all work together. And so I think that's a great example of how if we allow certain voices to get into the conversation, they're going to say, this is just like phonics. I've read it. I've read it in the movement that call itself the science of math, peer-reviewed quote unquote articles that they're saying that this is just like phonics. And I'm sitting there like, oh my gosh, you guys, you don't even get it. Like phonics is not the only thing we need in reading, just like number sense is not the only thing that we need in math.
Ryan, what say you?
I actually agree with a lot of what Courtney's saying. I think she's making part of my argument for me. I think that the idea of memorization is very tricky in math, because the idea behind math should be the concept of fluency, or if we're talking about basic math fact, the idea of automaticity. We're not memorizing something so we can pass a test on Friday or so that we can pass the SAT or get into the right school that we want to get into. We're trying to learn math so we can read and write and mathematize the world. We're trying to make it usable for kids so that they can lead a life that allows them to solve problems or to advance their own agenda because they understand the math that's taking place. If all we're teaching kids is to memorize, we're teaching them shortcuts and tricks. But that's not math, right? A shortcut or a trick is not mathematical content. If we want kids to wrap their heads around mathematical content, we need to teach them mathematical content, not a shortcut or a trick or a way to memorize.
Courtney, I want to come back to you because something you said about the science of reading, and they talk a lot about like the structured literacy approach. Is there a structured math approach that's an equivalent? Is that something that's a thing? And if so, like what are those core components?
Well, so I think that's a really great question, Rob. And one that we have at the Plessner House quite a bit because, it's so interesting that I learned whole language in college. Like that was all my college professors talked about. I also had a class where I learned all of the, names and words in phonics and phoneme awareness, but I don't really remember that, to be honest. I learned all of that in school, working with teachers and figuring out what to do. But I taught first and second grade, specifically because I wanted to teach kids how to read. So I really dug into how do you do this really, really well? And phonics and phonemic awareness were a part of that. But so were reading aloud, guided reading, sitting side by side in reading, writing, shared writing. All of those things were a part of that. And for me, that was that's balanced literacy. And that was how I learned what balanced literacy was. So one of the issues that is out there in the world is a very deep misunderstanding that whole language is the same as balanced literacy. And listening to the podcasts about it and the people talk about it have really, my gears get grinded. Is that the right term? A lot, easily, passionately. Ryan gets to listen to that. So anyway, again, Ryan was my first mentor and colleague, and there was really specific work out of the University of Wisconsin at Madison with the Metropolitan School District of Madison on a balanced math approach to teaching mathematics. And so, I mean, this is really Ryan's conversation, but he's taught it to me. But in it, we have fact fluency and maintenance, we have problem solving, we have number work, and we have inspecting equations or algebraic reasoning. And those 4 things working together is a balanced math approach. And so Ryan and I, and people will call us who did workshops with us years and years and years ago, and they'll be like, will you come back and talk about balanced math? And I'm like, oh God, like, if we say the words balanced math, are we gonna be canceled? Because balanced literacy got canceled. And so Ryan and I are going back and forth having these conversations about what word do we use? Like, how do we change the word? And like, that is sort of my point. Like, why do we have to talk about changing a word when it's a perfectly good word to describe an approach to teaching mathematics, to use as a lens to analyze textbooks, to plan lesson plans, all of it, because the word has been vilified in reading. And that's just not okay. So Ryan's approach has been, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, he's not changing it. But I'm like tiptoeing around the words when I'm out doing PD. Like, I'll say it and then I'll be like, or we could call it this or we could call it that, because I don't want to be canceled. I just want to be able to teach what needs to be taught, So I love that you asked that question, because that balanced math approach to teaching mathematics has been the core of what we have done all these years.
I want to take us in a little bit different direction. I'm wondering, Ryan, so you think math and reading teaching overlap? What about other subjects? Like, why don't we just do the same thing in every subject? And also, does your approach work up the grade levels, like into high school and things, or are you just talking about elementary? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so most of my work is with elementary schools, but I have done work with middle schools and with high schools. You have to talk about it in a little bit different way. The emphases are placed in different areas. I mean, when you're 5 years old, you have to know what the number 5 is before you can add 5 plus 2. So we have to spend a lot of time in number work before we can get to a lot of the other things. When we get into the middle grades and we start moving to the coordinate plane and we start getting ready for pre-algebra and things like that, we have to spend more time on that inspecting equations blocks, which is the algebra readiness piece. So while there are different components of the model that Courtney was talking to you about, I think that it can be used in every grade level. We just have to try and figure out what's the component that's the most important at this point for the kids that I have in my classroom. When it comes to looking across different subject matters, I think that's why we have STEM, right? Like, we're supposed to be integrating these things together. We're supposed to be doing science, math, technology, engineering. We even have STEAM, where art is coming into that. So the idea that math is a standalone concept is kind of antiquated. We have to integrate these things so that kids can understand the power that math has, and not only the power, but also the beauty. When you listen to an orchestra concert, I want you to hear the math. When you look at a beautiful building that's been designed, I want you to look at the architecture and see the patterns and see the math that was used to inspire that building. So if we don't make these connections across different content areas, if we don't match it to the real world and help kids see the beauty in patterns and the beauty in construction and architecture and all these other things, how are they really going to be able to read the world of mathematics?
Yeah, and with that, like, when we go to Courtney, like, I love that you want to put math first and talk about how awesome math is. But then, are we separating things in a way that kids don't see connections across disciplines?
Yeah, no. So I totally agree with Ryan. Like, I want to have those same conversations. If they are, when they're learning to read the sign Target, when they're driving down the road and they see the bullseye and they know it's Target, but they've never seen the word before, but they say it, that's great. I want them to count, windows on cars as they're going by. Like, I want to teach parents how to do both of those things, in their classrooms. And so I think it's more just like a side by side. Like, that was a huge thing for us when we had children. You get the, like, here's how you take care of your 6-month-old piece of paper when you go to the doctor's office, which is funny because it's a lot deeper than that piece of paper. But on it says things like read aloud to them, but it never says count to them. It never says, we would sit at our picture window in our house, and we lived right down the street from a school, and we would watch the school buses go by and we would count the school buses. Our son's first sentence was, I see 2 buses, because he saw 2 buses. Why? Because we used that language and we counted with him over and over and over again. But we knew to do that. So it's like an afterthought. Math is just this constant afterthought. And so it's not that I don't want everything working together. I do. I love the routines being across content areas. Absolutely. You can totally do non-permanent vertical surfaces in any content area. But or, any kind of collaborative work, whatever, in any content area. But it's an afterthought. And I'm trying to figure out what has to happen in our world that the legislation for math comes before the legislation for reading. Like what needs to happen in order for that to be a primary part of the conversation?
It's just much easier to say that we suck as a country for math. That's my opinion, uh, as opposed to doing something about it.
Right.
All right. The final thing from me is, how does the role of student engagement and motivation differ from reading to math instruction? And how can teachers effectively foster both? That's hard. I remember purposely, as a senior in high school, finding ways to get removed from English class because I could not stand it. Like that was, but also in full transparency, I did that in sixth grade too. So, so how does the role of student engagement and motivation differ between the two? And how can teachers foster both?
I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that, especially at a young age, kids are taking a lot of cues from the people around them in the world. If parents say things like, I was never really good at math, but we'll muddle through this together, or if teachers are saying, I'm learning right along with you, I don't know how to do this either, we're sending unintended messages that have consequences, right? Kids will say, oh, look at my mom, she's amazing, I love her, it doesn't matter if I'm good at math. Or look at my teacher, he's such a great person that I admire, but he's not good at math, so I don't have to be good at math and I can still be a good person. So I think that it's really funny because we would never say that we can't read, but people say they can't do math all the time. There would be a social stigma if you said, I don't know how to read. But when you say, I don't know how, like, it's like a cutesy thing. Like you can buy shirts and all the big chains that say girl math. I'm like, what is that? Like, why do we put this stigma around math knowledge? So I think that the idea about motivating kids isn't so much about like kind of rah-rah cheerleading for them. I think the idea is just to help them see that math is something you do. You all do it. Even if you don't think you're good at math, you're doing math all day long, every day. You just might do it in a way that doesn't feel like the math that was crammed down your throat in elementary school. So how do we make sure that kids see us as successful in mathematics, that we're not sending a message that it's something that it's okay not to be good at, because we all have to be good at math. Right. So I think motivating kids is just about doing what we know is right. Let's just talk about math. Let's talk about how we use it. Let's make them see that we can do it, even if it's hard. And sometimes it is hard. It's not always fun. And that's okay. We can persevere and problem solve.
Is the engagement and motivation, are there similar approaches for reading and math? I mean, because you're kind of saying we should teach them together. Is there a similar approach?
I think that the same thing happens. I mean, if you think about when you have a baby, a lot of kids lap read to their kids, right? And just like Courtney said, do you count with your kids? Do you show them patterns? Do you go on walks and count the number of sidewalk squares that you're walking on, or count the number of trees that are going by? Are you engaging them in those things just like you are in reading? We read all the time. Even if they're watching TV, there are things that are scrolling on, there are always words. How do we make sure that they're seeing both? How do we point out the score on a basketball game while we're also pointing out the words and the underscore that are running during the entire game? How do we help them see that there's lots of ways to communicate? There's information you can get from the words, but there's also information that you can get from the numbers or the shapes or the graphs or other things that are mathematically visible on the screen or in the books or newspapers, if those still exist in the next few years. Those things are in our world. When we drive down the road, we see numbers at gas stations. We see numbers on restaurant signs. We see them in menus. How do we help them see that together the words in a menu at a restaurant are just as important as the numbers in a menu at a restaurant? So I think that those things go hand in hand. And so how do we engage them in those conversations to show them that these things are both necessary to read and write the world?
And Courtney, if your messages to teachers about that too. It's especially in the elementary setting where, you have self-contained classrooms and you have, teachers typically, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but typically if they're in a self-contained classroom, they lean towards the reading piece and the young students, and they really enjoy doing that. But in math, it's something they just have to do. Like, how can we like get those teachers to bring up like the motivation for both and show equal importance for both in those classrooms?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with, well, number one, helping them sort of have that realization, and that this goes back to my intro of like, it's kind of crazy that I'm arguing against it, because it was making the comparison was what helped transfer everything that I did and my thinking. Ryan taught me how to do a math fact interview, and I was like, oh, this is just like a running record. Like, I can't even use the word running record anymore. So if I want to teach teachers how to do a math fact interview and I make that comparison, I've done it. That's not good. Like, we have to stand back from that. We can't talk about the benefits of the fact interview. But it's also this idea of like, when I taught reading, the kids would do like book clubs and be in their reading notebooks, and they were asking questions and making predictions, and sometimes they were wrong about their predictions, and they liked characters and they didn't like characters, and they explained why, and they could read passages and make connections to their life and the world around them. And that was such a huge part of reading. But in math class, they were just standing, sitting at their seats watching me stand and mimicking me. And I, half the time, really probably didn't even know what I was doing. So I think part of that work is like seeing the beauty in the question asking, in the productive struggle, in the giving an answer that, might not be right, but using that as a learning experience, just like we do in reading. So that's where I'm just completely on board with that. But helping teachers see the value in that by doing the math with them. So I get asked all the time, I don't have time for this, I don't have time for that. I'm like, if anything, just choose a math problem and just do it with your grade level team. Just do it with your team and try to think about all the different ways kids might respond to it, and then and why they might do that. Like, just do some math. Just engage with it yourself so that you have a chance to kind of walk in your students' shoes and see how they might engage with that. And then that could potentially help with that overall engagement and motivation for them, and helping the teachers understand, like, there's 0% chance that you're going to know every single thing that your kid is thinking about in their head in your classroom. It's not going to happen. So being willing to take that risk is teaching them how to take that risk. And we can do that in math class, and then, that carries on through life. Productive struggle and risk taking are things that we need to do in all aspects of our life. So I think a lot of engagement and motivation can come when we're giving teachers the opportunity to do that.
I just have one last question for you both. So this has been a lovely discussion, and I love that you're a married couple who finds lots of ways to agree on things, even though you feel differently. But I want to lean into the disagreement. I want to hear from each of you. I'll start with you, Ryan. I'm wondering, what's the biggest argument about that Courtney's making that you disagree with, or what's the one thing she's really getting wrong in your opinion about because you think math and reading should be very similar in the way they're taught?
Well, I actually wrote down a phrase that she said that I actually kind of liked, but I'm going to argue against it, even though I love it. I feel like it should be a bumper sticker, right? She said, math is awesome. It should stand on its own. But I think that math is awesome, and we can also make it integrated with other ideas. I think that standing on its own isolates it from everything else, which leads to some of the disconnects that kids have between math and the rest of the world. So if we isolate it, kids can't make the connections. Let's integrate it into everything we do. Let's help them see how it plays out in reading context. Let's help them see how it plays out in social studies, in history, in science, in art classes, in music classes. We can make all of that happen by not isolating math, not making it stand on its own.
And Courtney, what do you think is the biggest thing Ryan's getting wrong?
So I totally agree with what Ryan's saying, except I'm definitely not saying isolate it. The thing that I disagree with is almost like a hopeful thing. It's like if we stop making the connection be about like your strengths being reading, rather let's work with teachers to show how their strengths can be about math, then that can make a lot of change in the classroom. So I'm all about building off strengths. Like, that's how you teach well. And I want teachers to be able to learn by building off their strengths too, for sure. But how do we collect those strengths in a math environment and not so that we can move forward with that and make the connections from there? Why do we always have to start with another content area? And so at some point, someone's got to do something to make that be possible. And like, what is that point? Like, when is that going to be? And so we have to do that work.
All right. Thank you both. And that concludes our questions. And we will now end by giving each side 2 minutes to make their final arguments to you.
Starting first, Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris and Rob. First of all, I want to say, luckily, most of your listeners will experience this discussion as a podcast, so they won't be able to be swayed by my wife's charming smile or her beautiful eyes. But I do think that we need to make sure that we integrate the teaching of mathematics and writing, or reading and writing and mathematics, because there are so many similarities. I'll give one last quick example. When kids recite the alphabet, they say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and all that. And they think that LMNOP is one word. So they've memorized a string of words or of letters. They can't necessarily distinguish between those letters. The same thing happens with numbers. We get really impressed when kids can count really high, but then we'll say something like, what comes after 12? And they can't tell you what comes after 12 because they're at that developmental progression where they're memorizing strings of words. Knowing that that happens early in reading and it happens early in math is a really important connection for us to make with educators out in the field who are working with young children. Similarly, when we get kids to track a sentence as they're learning how to read and distinguish each word, we want them to tag with their finger when they're counting things. If we can integrate the idea that human development kind of parallels in some of these ways, we can make connections that we wouldn't be able to make if we were isolating math from the teaching of reading and writing. So I know that anyone who knows me knows that I am very competitive. And while I'd love to win this debate, my assumption is that your listeners are savvy enough to understand that we're all on the same team here. We're all working to make sure that every child gets an education that allows her or him or them to become an informed citizen who contributes to society and that can live a meaningful and fulfilling life.
I was awful charming yourself.
All right. And with the final word, we have Courtney. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I once had an elementary principal say to me, she was really struggling with getting her teachers on board with thinking about math differently in any way whatsoever. And she was racking her brain to try to figure out, what can I say to them? And her example was, you know how when we preview a book and we look at the pictures and we wonder what the book is going to be about, and we're like, oh, and we put on a show about the book to engage the kids in the reading. She said to me, I had this thought the other day that's what math is. She's like, really, math is just about 10 digits that when you organize them differently and move in other symbols and other mathematical ideas, everything changes, but it all starts with these 10 digits. And I remember thinking to myself when she said that is like amazing. That is like magical. That is the way that we're, yes. And I guess I'm just really wondering and passionate about this idea of, when can that come first? When can the magic behind those 10 digits, and with moving them around and putting another digit in front or another digit behind and adding in some other symbols and all the things that mathematicians do, when can that be what we talk about? And we compare that to how you might open a book and start exploring a book. And it's just over and over and over again, like Ryan mentioned before, people talk about how they're not math people, or, we run across them wherever we are out and about, and they find out what we do, and they're like, ooh, like, I'm not a math person. I'm never like that. And, the response is, you totally are. You were just taught wrong, which is why we do what we do. And it has to become unacceptable. It has to be not okay for that to be a common term in movies and books and podcasts and all kinds of literature. Something has to stop to make that stop. And I think that the place that's going to happen is in school. So I'm 100% on board with the connection needs to go across, and that can be really powerful teaching and learning for students and teachers. I'm just wondering why something else always has to come first, and what we have to do as a math education community to keep pushing this idea that it doesn't have to be that way. And let's not let math turn into the controversy that it already is, because it already exists. What do we have to do so it doesn't get worse than that. So I just that's my closing argument.
Very good. Well, thank you both. And that concludes a wonderful debate with our first married couple debater.
Now
Thanks,
it's
you
up to
guys.
our listeners. It's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the arguments, share with friends, and consider what resonated with you. Be sure to follow us on Blue Sky at Debate Math to share your thoughts on this debate. What stood out most to you?
And again, huge thanks to our two guests who came on and disagreed, but found lots of ways to agree and still get along. And hopefully you'll still be in a good place tonight when you go home together.
We should be fine.
And thanks to those who are listening, and we hope you enjoyed and learned from this.
And as we wrap up, Ryan, where can listeners find you?
I am primarily on Blue Sky at Ryan Flessner.
And Courtney, where can listeners find you?
Yep, my handle is at CFless on Blue Sky. That's where I primarily am too. I also spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, Courtney Flessner, and trying to connect with people there as well.
And also your podcasts? Where can we find it?
My sporadic podcast, Math and Other Things, season 1-ish can be found by itself, Math and Other Things. And season 2 is within the Keep Indiana Learning podcast network. We have 3 or 4 different podcasts that we are running within that network, and you can find Math and Other Things in that network.
Awesome. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list and get your first set of example debate activities you could use with your students today. Go to luzniak.com/podcast.
Don't forget to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com or follow us on Twitter at DebateMathPod and follow along with #DebateMathPod.
Rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us.
Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you more next episode. Until next time, cheers.